Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Bert Hodges. I'm very pleased to be a member of this panel along with Ruth and with Joanna. My topic today is conversing as perceiving and acting and caring, an ecological approach to language. Hopefully this will contribute to the celebration in honor of Mark. The first thing to start with is just the question of scale. At what scale should we attack language? Robert Laughlin and David Pines in physics has argued that in physics, in complex systems, physicists need to scale up from what they're used to doing to focus on what they call the richness, the collective, the emergent. And I think that exactly the same thing needs to happen in language. We tend to focus on phonemes or words or sentences or something much smaller units than I think is appropriate for studying at least the kinds of things that I want to study in language. And speaking both as a social psychologist and an ecological one, both of which I am, you would assume that we would focus on these larger scales, but we have not. And I myself, for years, taught language like most people did as rule governed, till one day I woke up mid-lecture and realized that can't be all that's going on. Here's a simple example. This is from Smith, who was a student of Chomsky's. He tries to have this clever example of how language is rule governed, but it's an isolated and decontextualized sentence that he offers. But he's actually imagining a context. He says, I speak fluently English. Well, he thinks, of course, that's not the way a fluent English speaker would speak. But I looked at that and went, wait a minute. What about the sentence, I speak fluently English, Swahili, and French? And I thought, that's fine. You have the same four words in the same order. And if he doesn't like that, I have a second choice. I speak fluently English, Swahili, and French. I speak only a little. Now the question is, was that just a bad choice of a rule, a bad choice of an example, or is there something deeper going on? I think something deeper is going on. I think language is not rule governed. More is going on, and I'll try to say something about what I think that is. The specific thing to notice here is what happened is shifting conversational contexts create new opportunities. So it turns out the more profound and positive side of the claim that rules alone are inadequate is that language is context sensitive and interdependent, often exquisitely so, in ways that I think traditional views don't capture. A slight change in context shifted what appeared to be a fixed regime, which following a rule, into another region of possibilities. Regions of possibilities is what ecological psychologists call affordances. So the counterexample was generated by extending the range of domains to which the skill, speak fluently, applied. This extension shifted the focus from a particular domain, English, to the skill, fluency, and its range, which changed the grammatical affordances. That is where, in this case, an adverb could fit. This shift in focus tipped the balance of the dynamic slightly. What had been impossible or at least awkward became possible and even elegant. Only an elegant speaker would have used a sentence like that. Now, both Ruth and Joanna have worked at this larger scale, I think. It's one of the reasons they're on this panel, is Ruth has worked to develop approaches to syntax that are dialogical, that go beyond not only individual sentences, but beyond individual participants in a conversation. And Joanna has looked at the relationship between various scales, slower and faster, larger and smaller, and how those interactions and dependencies across levels affect what is said and understood. Instead of asking how utterances can be grounded in action and perception, she asks how action and perception can come to function more abstractly over larger space-time scales. Now, in the spirit of scaling up, let me ask some big questions. I'm really not a language scholar. I said I'm a social psychologist who kind of wandered into language, actually was dragged in, almost kicking and screaming, but I ask sort of naive, big questions here. What is language? What is language for? Why language exists at all? How does it work? And who engages in language or in conversing? Here are the answers that I'll give as a kind of sweep at the beginning, and then I'll fill in some of what I mean here in the rest of this talk. What is language? I think language is an action system, a perceptual system, and a caring system. What is language for? I think it's for realizing values. I'll say more about that later. And another way to say this, I think it's for finding our way in the world, for wayfinding, and for caring for ecosystems, others, and self. How does it work? Language, I think, is physical, social, and moral. It's a dialogical method for extending time and space for perceiving good prospects and participating in ecosystem agencies. I'll say again more about some of that later. It's fundamentally dialogical, as Ruth has pointed out. It entails disagreeing and agreeing in a joint search for realizing values, truth, justice, and lots of other values that can only be constituted collectively. It's not about, I think, I'm going to argue, conformity or individuation, at least primarily, but it's about creating new possibilities for action and perception. Language carries humans and is carried by them in ways that allow for increased clarity, coherence, comprehensiveness, and complexity, which is a kind of sweeping description of what culture is about. Who engages in language? My argument here, if I had time to develop it, I think would run along these lines: beings who carry, cooperate, and care, but don't conform and do suffer. So, what is language for? So here's the hypothesis. Learning to talk with each other is not about acquiring or activating some formal rule system called language. It's not conforming our utterances to some local patterns of sound, syntax, and semantics. It is not, as Bertrand Russell claimed, about asserting truths. It is not primarily a matter of persuading others to match our expectations, which social psychologists usually approach it from that perspective. It is more than coordination, Clark's hypothesis, or even cooperation, using language as a tool to achieve common goals. Rather, I think it's a way of caring for others, for ourselves, and for the world. So a more ecological approach begins, I think, with seeing conversational movements and it's literally movements that open up a field of action that could be perceived as moving in a good direction, I think, toward values. Conversations, I think, seek good prospects. We'll say more about that later. Good conversations create movements that afford the unfolding of still more affordances and richer ones. So it's about keeping the conversation going, but it's more than merely continuity of the conversation. It's because that opens up other affordances, other possibilities. Now, a footnote about agency, creativity, and responsibility here. Conversing with others is not a matter of deciphering some abstract structure or producing some outcome. Rather, it's a matter of ongoing agency. Agency, I think, is the initiation and pursuance of unforced actions that activate environmental potentials that constitute a real physical, social, moral field that constrains and guides ongoing activity. The agency is directed toward the goods of the ecosystem. Listening and talking with others generates affordances that, if actively explored, reveal their structure, which allows them to function as signs of further affordances. Through perceiving and acting linguistically, humans can make use of linguistic affordances to help realize other affordances. So the creativity of conversation is less about generating new syntactic combinations. That was sort of Chomsky's claim. It's more about jointly acting to create new possibilities that invite responsible action. So here's an example I give in one of the articles I put on. This is my son. This is a violation of rules. That's one of the things I got interested in from sort of social pragmatics, when we violate rules that create new possibilities for responsible action. Some years ago, my son, then 13, and I stood in our kitchen. A few months earlier, his mother had died of cancer, and his older sister had moved from home to take a job in Boston. As we prepared supper, my son was speaking longingly of the days when there were more of us and things were done differently. Looking tenderly at him, I said with determination, "Well, it's just us two bachelors now. We'll have to make the best of it." Without missing a beat, he glanced over at the male cat I had gotten for him a few days after his mother's death and said, "You forgot the cat. There are 3 of us bachelors." We both laughed and went back to making the best of it. Conversations seek good prospects. Conversations, at least ones that work, provide affordances for going on, both in the conversation and in life more generally. Good conversations create movements that afford the unfolding of still more affordances and richer ones. In the conversation with my son, our violations of the meaning of bachelor, that's the rule we broke, the semantic rule, express poignantly the violation, the loss that we both felt, the wishing and woe that is associated with bachelors, and the hopeful humor extended to another, in this case the cat, that with the help of others we would yet be successful in our search for joy. Here's another hypothesis. Language is a values realizing activity. Values, I want to claim, is what we are seeking when we speak, and I'm going to argue when we act and feel and think, is meanings are the signs directing us toward values. When we speak, we generally intend to speak articulately, grammatically, and meaningfully. More importantly, though, we usually intend to say something worthwhile, something that's valuable. But what does that mean? Toward what does that point us? Well, here's where the larger account of ecological values that I've worked on for a while comes in. So here we'll start with Terry Deacon, since he's involved in this event as well. He says, perhaps the most tragic feature of our age is just when we have developed a truly universal perspective from which to appreciate the vastness of the cosmos, we have at the same time conceived the realm of value as radically alienated from the seemingly complete understanding of the fabric of existence. In the natural sciences, there appears to be no place for right, wrong, meaningful, meaningless, beauty, ugliness, good, evil, love, hate, and so forth. Gibson claimed his whole approach to psychology was an attempt to replace a psychology of stimulus with a psychology of values. The visual system, he argued, hunts for comprehension and clarity. Exploring and optimizing seem to be functions of the system. Perceiving gets wider and finer and longer and richer and fuller as the observer explores the environment. A perception, in fact, does not have an end. Perceiving goes on. So I want to argue that he doesn't think perception is about goals so much as he thinks it's about values. Richer, wider, finer, longer, clearer, more comprehensive. Solomon Asch, one of my heroes in social psychology, in his 52 classic book, argued that we shouldn't confuse values with a number of other things that social psychologists regularly confuse it, and other psychologists regularly confuse them with. One, he said, they're not cultural rules. Rules depend on values, not vice versa. A second temptation, he thinks, is to treat values as a species of desires or needs. However, values cannot be reduced to preferences or goals on the one hand, nor necessities or causes on the other hand. A third temptation is to see values as habits or anticipations. Rather, he argues, values are obligations that cannot be vouchsafed or excused by their hedonic consequences. A fourth temptation is to read values as emotional reactions or an acknowledgement of conventional authority. Values, he counters, are rational standards to which emotions and authorities must answer. Now, for a simple example here, the way I try to understand what values are the goods that define an ecosystem or the fields within an ecosystem. So here, this is an example from an early Gibson paper that's became a classic. What he called the field of safe travel. This is from a 1938 paper. I've argued that what he describes here is the field of safe travel. That is, once you've put the car into motion, a field of opportunities opens up for where you can go safely, and that's constantly changing in its shape and size. That's a physical field in the sense that we talk about fields in physics. It's continuously expanding and contracting. It's a social field. It's constrained by rules and other drivers and pedestrians and animals, and it's also a moral field. It's motivated by goods. Epistemic goods like accuracy are required for driving. Ethical values, justice, sharing the road, etc. Ontological, we need to be safe. We need to protect life. Values realizing activity is obligatory in this sense. There is a field of safe travel, for example, whether a driver is looking where he or she ought to be looking or not. The field of safe travel may at some particular point not be nested within the momentary optic flow field of the driver. I could be looking at my partner in the back seat or something like that to talk to them rather than looking where I should be looking. Thus, good driving is not automatic or a lawful consequence of the structuring of the system. It demands directed activity, that is, responsible agency. Similarly, it is not just following rules. Okay, I can stay in my lane and still be a bad driver. So what does an ecological theory of values look like? Here's a quick sketch of some of the things that I think would go into an appropriate theory here. Values realizing theory is an approach to action, perception, emotion, and cognition that claims that these are constrained by values. Constraints are understood here as enabling and limiting. Values are ecosystem demands, the boundary conditions of self-organizing ecosystems. These boundary conditions provide for the dynamics of self-organizing ecosystems and the directedness of animate activity within it. Values are not properties of persons, either as biological or social beings, or properties of objects in isolation. Rather, values are the demands that ecosystems place on ways of life or niches within the system, the goods that must be realized for niches to flourish and develop. It is these real ecosystem goods that make it possible to define and evaluate acting, perceiving, feeling, and thinking. Third thing is all animate beings, I think, from bacteria to humans, are motivated to realize values. Action, perception, cognition, and emotion are all forms of values realizing. For example, carrying is an action that entails moving from something from where it is to where it ought better to be. Action, perception, cognition, and emotion are all movements in some sense from is to ought, scaled on physical, social, and moral dimensions simultaneously. Thus, animate activity routinely defies Hume's characterization of experience as inept and action as non-efficacious. What logic, I think, cannot accomplish, Hume was right about that, ordinary animate activity does routinely. D, all actions are constrained by multiple values. Any given value cannot be realized in isolation, but only jointly as other values are also realized. These multiple values are hierarchically organized. The term hierarchical means that actions are mutually constrained by all the values so that there is no fixed hierarchical ordering of values. Rather, across time and task, values vary in their ordering for the sake of the joint realization of all the values. That is, the ecosystem as a whole. In driving, for example, speed and accuracy may take priority over safety at one place or time, but then reverse at another. These aren't simple trade-offs. Sometimes safety might lead to increased speed. You might need to go faster to be safe and have tighter tolerances, be more accurate in your driving. So values are plural, they're hierarchical. They also function as what legitimates action and thought. Values are not the same, I think, as laws, rules, or goals. Reuben Barron and I have argued this starting 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Goals and rules answer to values, I think. Values form the dynamic context in which laws are recruited and coordinated. Values are the basis for choosing goals and rules, harnessing laws, and coordinating laws and rules. Now, this plural, hierarchical, legitimating character of values realizing is marked by frustration. And this, I mean, more in the sense that comes out of physics, but it relates to the way we think about frustration in sort of everyday life. This is quoting from Beek and Turvey and their colleagues. Biological action systems are to a considerable extent frustrated, meaning that they are subject simultaneously to very many different physical requirements that they cannot possibly satisfy fully. So systems are constrained by multiple attractors or requirements that cannot be satisfied fully. Juggling is an example of that. The way hearts function, if they're healthy, are that way as well. There's an inability to achieve a given value as if it were a goal. Values cannot be reduced to goals. Values realizing is open-ended and edgy. It's on the edge of chaos and order. Let me apply that to language here briefly. Complex physical systems, including visual systems and linguistic systems, for example, are a continuous juggling act, always moving to keep things balanced on the edge between order and chaos, between stability and freedom. There is no single point that is our destination in looking or in conversing. Rather, there is the ongoing process of distinguishing, relating, grasping, and letting go to try a new way of grasping, relating, and distinguishing. In short, there is always more to learn. So values are developing. Our awareness of values develops over time. We can become clearer about what clarity demands of us or what it means to be just or kind or caring with our children or our neighbors. As ecosystems and the practices they support evolve, new forms of values, new forms of accuracy, justice, safety may emerge. Values are partially tacit, self-revealing, and they demand a complementary responsibility on the part of agents. The hierarchical, the hierarchical interdependence of values creates an intrinsic dynamic that motivates ongoing change that is both directed and open-ended. Thus, language cannot be reduced to goal-seeking or rule-following. Furthermore, it cannot be accounted for only in terms of natural laws. So, what is language, and how does it work? All right, so as noted earlier, I'm going to argue that language is a perceptual system, an action system, and a caring system. So what about language as a perceptual system? So increasing comprehension and acknowledging presence. My primary hypothesis here has been to put forward the notion of dialogical arrays. I'm playing off of optic arrays, acoustic arrays, which Gibson talked about, and I'll mention again in a minute. A dialogical array is a group of hearer-speakers surrounding a given speaker-hearer, listening and talking in ways that provide information about the common ground that they literally share, and that is the immediate physical, social, moral situation in which they all find themselves. It can provide information about places from which people in the array have come, in the events in which they have participated. It can even reveal something of the intentions of the array's participants regarding their prospects for future events and activities. Dialogical arrays help to locate us in a much larger world than the one provided by our own point of view. It extends any individual participant's perceptual reach both temporally and spatially by orders of magnitude. Dialogical arrays invite us to go beyond the horizon of our common ground. Language bespeaks a presence. In dialogue, we reach beyond our horizons through others to learn of the sources of ontological care that have made our existence, our conversation, and our purpose possible. Every time we speak and listen, we embody the ontological conviction that we are not alone. Gibson proposed that these informative patterns can be treated as arrays, acoustic, optic, chemical, and so on, that a given animal can sample over time by exploratory actions that are ordered in some way. Language, though, does not seem to be like seeing, hearing, and other senses since it has no specialized receptors. Language is not usually viewed as a way of perceiving the world in a way that is straightforward. It seems limited to exploring other people. But is this really the case? What Gibson acknowledged was that conversing allows one to, quote, to see through the eyes of another. Nevertheless, he claimed that listening to others' descriptions of the world provides only indirect knowledge, since the speaker, not the listener, selects the information to be articulated, whether by assertion, question, invitation, or command. However, this need not be the case, since the dialogical array is an action array as well as a perceptual array. Words like gestures can be used to direct the sense organs of the hearer toward parts of the environment he would not otherwise perceive, and to induce a second-hand perception of parts of the larger environment that the speaker has perceived but the hearer has not. So that's Gibson. But overall, Gibson's doubts about the directness and trustworthiness of another's looking are the result of his lack of appreciation for the dialogical nature of language. A dialogical array is jointly created and sustained. Only in our active probing and being willing to be probed is it possible to learn about our situation and its prospects. As we probe with questions, declarations, exclamations, proposals, and all the other modes of linguistic looking, we can increasingly come to see, much as in ordinary vision, our real prospects for doing something worthwhile together. Dialogical arrays are also collective. They necessarily invoke involve multiple people interacting if information is to be made available. No individual can control or manipulate the array. Rather, it is agentic. Dialogical arrays are not causal. One person may speak, but the response provoked may or may not be informative about the common ground of their situation or what lies beyond that common ground. Wendell Berry notes that in a conversation, you always expect a reply. And if you honor the other party to the conversation, if you honor the otherness of the other party, you understand that you must not expect always to receive a reply that you foresee or a reply that you will like. A conversation is immitigably two-sided and always, to some degree, mysterious. It requires faith. So speaking and listening, I think, are risk-taking adventures, but they provide crucial resources for moving prospectively into an uncertain future with the confidence, humility, and hope necessary to our lives. So what about language as an action system? We'll consider the invitation to creativity and culture, as we might put it, and the responsibility of what I'll call irreversibility and answerability. To start with, it's worth pointing out, and here I'm quoting from Ed Reed, human children do not, strictly speaking, learn something called language, but instead develop a repertoire of skills, cognitive, social, as well as communicative, that enable them to become competent junior partners in their community. A simple point, but a profound one, I think. Actions are realizations of what the environment affords, Reed says, and the systemic nature of actions must be understood at the larger, richer collective scale of Laughlin and Pines, I would add. If language is viewed as action, then the criteria for evaluating language is no longer grammaticality, as Thomas Holtgraves has pointed out, and I would add, neither is semantic accuracy and directness. So, as a hypothesis about language as an action system, language contributes to the ability of communities to engage in collective action over greater stretches of time and space, which enables the creation of new affordances. Language contributes to coordination, to sharing, to caring, all of which are constitutive aspects of culture. Language is founded in trust, truth, and social solidarity, among other values. The larger joint project of wayfinding and caring, to which language contributes, occurs in contexts that require great sensitivity. The various aspects of language are systematically interdependent in ways that bespeak presences and obligations that go far beyond the immediate horizon of task and topic. Conversing must take on the role of questioning, of disagreeing, of doubting, of debating. This is because language is intrinsically dialogical and moral. So a simple, perhaps odd example of the argumentative, dialogical nature of language is this one from me and my daughter a number of years ago. She was about 4. We were driving somewhere. I pointed out something to her, and I see that over there? To which Sasha, my daughter, said, I've seen that before. And I couldn't resist, so I said, you mean I've seen that before? To which Sasha replied with some irritation and emphasis, okay, I've seen that before. Her response acknowledged my concern without conforming. Rather, she created another possible appropriate form, another possible rule, another way English could have emerged, rather than the way that it did. It demonstrated both, I think, her social solidarity with her linguistic community and her lack of conformity. Socially, she had cleverly acknowledged, in a sense, my linguistic authority, and she had also put me in my place. Mikhail Bakhtin, who is not well known among psychologists, has provided one of the most compelling hypotheses, I think, about language understood as action. It is always addressed, and not only by the speaker to the listener. He argues that conversing always assumes a virtual third party in addition to the two parties that we minimally assume a conversation or dialogue entails. This super addressee, as he calls it, is a powerful, if invisible presence, which might be understood as, quote, God, absolute truth, the court of dispassionate human conscience, the people, the court of history, science, and so forth. It functions as the witness and judge, as he puts it, of what we say and do, and is a constitutive aspect of the whole utterance, who, under deeper analysis, can be revealed in it. So addressing and being addressed helps us to understand the world, history, and the social and moral orders within which humans operate. We might think of this larger context or order that is revealed in conversation in terms of values. Without a larger horizon of values that we can acknowledge in our actions, words would be worthless. From a values realizing perspective, the central fact of language is answerability, which is Bakhtín's term for the obligations inherent in addressing and being addressed in specific historical circumstances where action on behalf of others and oneself is required. And here I'm quoting from a paper Carol Fowler and I wrote, "When humans speak and listen, or write and read, these actions irreversibly place us. They locate us in specific physical and social ecologies, and they emerge from temporal scales ranging from evolutionary and cultural to interpersonal and microneural. To postulate a question, a statement, or even to give a grunt or groan is to locate oneself, to take a stance with respect to oneself, to others, including predecessors and successors, as well as those to whom one now speaks or writes, and to the geographies and tasks within which those selves are located. Actions, including those of ordinary conversations, cannot be done without pointing to oneself and to the responsibility entailed in speaking or listening." To speak meaningfully is to engage in an act of irreversible, impredicative responsibility to addressees. To say that an act is impredicative is to say that it is self-referential. It points to the self, locating it as responsible to the other, and to assessing properly their current location and relation, and to prospecting together their future possible directions. The irreversibility of action is that it moves in some real direction with real force. It cannot be taken back. Speaking is such an action in its ecological setting. We say what we say as who we are, to whom we say it, at the time and place of the saying, and all of this gives ontological and moral heft to our utterances. So the irreversibility of language suggests that the directness of language, its meaning and value, lies not in some deductive certainty, but in the subtle social and moral dynamics of real physical bodies, dialogically arrayed, that have directly shared and cared for a set of places and tasks over a common history, working to do the next thing that needs to be done for the good of those places, those tasks, and themselves. Finally, we come to language as a caring system, the necessity of complexity. Recent research has suggested that linguistic activities are far more complex than has generally been assumed, being distributed over many space-time scales, which are far more interdependent and integrated than previously imagined. Central to this complexity are context sensitivity and global interdependence. The distinctive character of caring embodied in conversation emerges from two features of complex dynamical systems: context sensitivity and interdependency. Caring arises out of the interdependency and demands context sensitivity. The pragmatics of languaging and language can thus largely be summarized as learning how to be caring and careful in our speaking and listening to each other. To care and to be careful is to evaluate and select better and worse ways to move, or to speak, or to understand. Every aspect of language involves the selection and shaping of movements, from pronunciation to syntax, from word choice to the choice of addressees. All of these implicit, largely unconscious choices depend on values realizing dynamics. At the heart of language one finds, then, not a biologically hardwired formalism for syntactic well-formedness, but a complex set of moral, social, physical skills, virtues we might call them, that are jointly shaping actions in search of good continuations and good prospects. Language is a caring system, as well as an action system and a perceptual system. The choices made by linguists and psychologists to focus on small-scale units have hindered their noticing these larger-scale skills and their intimate relation to values and virtues. Even when the focus is on pragmatics in the study of language, the tendency is to describe pragmatic constraints on speaking and listening as social rules on the one hand, or law-like logic of communication on the other. For example, I think Paul Grice's well-known pragmatic requirements for effective conversation are often treated as rules or laws. However, I think his maxims for cooperative conversation point to values that must be realized and virtues that must be practiced for conversations to work. Truth, kindness, justice, economy, clarity, and coherence are among the obligatory demands that constrain and enable sentient speech, sensitive comprehension, and productive linguistic engagements. Anthony Holliday has argued that semantic facts within a linguistic community are not mere conventions. Rather, they are grounded in ethical values. Among these, those he considers are truth, justice, sincerity, trust, and awe, noting that in imagining a language, we presuppose a mode of deep-seated agreement, which is only possible if the integrity of persons who speak the language is sustained. And clearly this cannot be done unless reverence for persons and their rights to speak and be listened to is a prevailing norm. Although theorists and researchers speak to it far less often, listeners must also practice a range of virtues, including charity, creativity, trust, and patience. All the articulatory, syntactic, and semantic precision and sophistication in the world would be useless without these virtues and the values they help us to realize. The point of language is far more complex and systemic than creating or comprehending a properly formed sentence or even a whole string of sentences. The creativity of language is primarily about creating new possibilities for action rather than generating new sequences of sounds that are grammatical. More importantly, these new possibilities generally are jointly created so that it is together that conversational partners are enabled to improve themselves and their surroundings, including others. The most crucial difference between communicative gesturing in apes and in humans is not the use of symbols, semantics, or the ordering of symbols, syntax, or the refinement of vocalized gestures, phonemic prosody. Rather, humans came to care about each other in a way that apes, other apes do not, which led then to their being cooperative in unprecedented ways, according to Tomasello. If this hypothesis is correct, it is pragmatics that is the most biologically basic aspect of language, not syntax or semantics. Syntax and semantics emerge from pragmatic constraints as cultural developments that become stabilized with the emergence of norms and some level of conformity to them. So expanding our horizons, the culturing made possible by dialogical arrays and the expansion of horizons of value elaborating and value creating activity emerging from them have created new ways of caring for the world. Humans' distinctive calling is not only culturing, but more precisely, caretaking. So finally, we come to our fourth question: who engages in language, or how did this emerge? So what I'm going to argue is how humans became caring, cooperative, and conversing, but not conforming. To begin, I'll start with Tomasello's interdependence hypothesis about the evolution of language. He argues there are two major transitions that had to occur for language to occur. One was how humans became so cooperative. They're much more cooperative than other apes. And how did humans become so cultural? So Tomasello's answers to the two questions are how did humans become so cooperative is the first is collaborative hunting, he thinks was the means for that. For the second question, how did they become so cultural, enabling them to engage with conventions, norms, institutions, was their ability to conform to each other, to imitate each other. So for an overview of the first part of my argument here, the story is going to be much larger and longer and more complex, I think, than the story of collaborative hunting. I think Tomasello's story is too simple. Secondly, it's going to be centered around bipedalism and a host of other anatomical changes that co-evolved with bipedalism, which had major consequences for social relations and joint action. The oversimplified gist might be bipedal walking led to carrying, which led to caring, which led to cooperating, which led to division and diffusion of labor. The last thing is that there will be a discussion of dialogical engagement of infants and caretakers, including mothers, fathers, and others, and the surprising finding perhaps that vulnerability is a strength. Part two of the story is that the conformity story is much too simple. Conformity is not nearly as pervasive as Tomasello has assumed. In fact, the evidence from anthropological, social, and developmental psychology shows that divergence is pervasive as well. What is needed, I think, is a larger dynamics of divergence and convergence, a kind of dialogical learning rather than conformity or independence. What allowed, I think, cooperation to emerge and to become institutionalized in conversations and cultural practices was learning together to realize multiple values rather than simply collaborating to achieve goals. So dialogue and argument, not conformity, are what are essential. Humans have traveled farther than most other animals, including chimpanzees and bonobos, their closest kin, extending their range to a wide variety of novel and challenging habitats. To accomplish this, they have had to cooperate in unprecedented fashion, working together in ways that demanded care, creativity, and conformity. Here I'm going to quickly describe a variety of findings from anthropological literature based on a number of authors. I put this together in a unique way that develops what is at least a plausible story for how cooperation, caring, and conversing might have evolved. We'll start on the left there with bipedalism. Why did bipedalism emerge? We don't know for sure, but once it got going, however it is, the most common assumption is that something about energetics, number 3 there, that it would have been more efficient for traveling greater distances. That proved to be true eventually, the evidence suggests. It's very unlikely that was true at the beginning as bipedalism was emerging. It would allow carrying of more food, so that may have put some pressure on for that, but perhaps the most important thing and the most interesting thing for my argument is that it probably increased the safety of carrying infants. Infants dying when they were young by falling off their mothers, they were holding onto the hair of the mother, was pretty high, and it probably became much safer. Many more infants were likely to survive. That probably created considerable evolutionary pressure for bipedalism. Related to that, of course, is above that hair loss. Homo ergaster and Homo erectus were losing hair. This seemed to have been stabilized by 1.2 million years ago. Infants can't hold on anymore, so they need to be carried. Bipedalism makes that possible. There may have been more touching and bonding in adults as well. Out of this, what seems to have happened is mothers may have begun to carry infants primarily. Fathers could have traveled and carried food and would have provisioned the mother and the infant. That's been particularly the proposal of Lovejoy. So we get this division of labor. We also see changes in anatomy and social interactions. There's the loss of canines in males, or the reduction in the size of the canines, and a reduction in aggression. In males, there's changes in sexual anatomy tied to pair bonding. So it looks like we're moving to a kind of monogamous family unit here. There was ovulatory crypsis. Females could have sex at any time, but it wasn't obvious. Penis structure in males changed so that ejaculation took longer. So this may have increased pair bonding and intimacy. Changes in toe anatomy so that they became less arboreal and could travel greater distances. Stein-Broughton has added to this hypothesis that I just laid out that he thinks there were changes in mother-infant relationships when bipedalism emerged and the hair decreased. When being carried by their mothers rather than riding on the back of their mothers, it changed from having the same perspective as their mothers when they were being carried on the back as opposed to being now focused on the mother. So he thinks there's the emergence of a kind of intimacy and alterity what he calls alter-centric mirroring. So they're each mirroring each other, they're looking at each other in a way that's going to change their relationship. Infant, he argues, has little choice but to attend to the mother's gestures and vocalizations. Now that the infant is looking at the mother, mother is now face to face with a helpless infant that invites being helped. The child's actions invite the adult to care and to converse eventually. So there's the beginning of a dialogical relationship between the mother and the infant. So he thinks the survival of early hominins depended as much on the ability of infants to attend closely to their mothers as it did on the adult's caretaking skills. Dean Falk, another anthropologist, has added to this what she calls the parking hypothesis. She's arguing that mothers would have carried their infants some while they were food gathering and stuff. To do that, they would have had to park their infant, put their infant down, but that would have invited, she thinks, verbal tethering, some kind of way to keep the infant engaged, some kind of vocalizations to keep the infant's attention. Which could have become a precursor to the emergence of conversing. McBride notes that it was never language that evolved, it was the conversation. I think he's right about that. So Sarah Hrdy has developed an alloparenting hypothesis in her book Mothers and Others, in which she argues because of the long period that children are helpless and need to be taken care of by adults, is there would have been too many infants for a mother to carry. So there became a need for mothers, like infants, to express their vulnerability, to invite attention and help from others. So the joint action of mothers and infants that had already existed needed to be reproduced at a larger scale. Humans, she thinks, are cooperative breeders. In other great apes, mothers provide about 100% of the infant care. In humans, it's only about 50%. So there becomes a diffusion of the division of labor. Carrying and caring are not restricted to kin or females or any other particular group. It's shared by the community. Carrying and caring become socialized. Infants now have to relate to many caretakers, so she argues they became connoisseurs of commitment. That is, emotional engagement occurs long before she thinks there are any linguistic exchanges, but those exchanges encourage infants to be discerning and selective, as well as trusting. So to summarize this first part of the argument, the revolution in cooperation may well have begun on the order of 1 to 2 million years ago, shortly after the emergence of the genus Homo, much earlier than Tomasello suggests. Second, the shift to greater cooperation was tied to bipedalism, carrying of infants, changes in infant-mother relations, mother-father relations, and mother-to-other and infant-to-other relations. Nothing in the thesis, argued, is pinned on a single emergent, for example, bipedal locomotion, as being the fountainhead of all that makes humans distinctive, as caring, trusting, cooperating, traveling companions who converse on the way. Finally, if what I argue in part 2 is true, then infants who sometimes dissented or diverged from the lead of caretakers may have done better than those that simply mirrored caretakers, as Broughton proposed. Splitting from others is a crucial part of why humans have traveled throughout the world. Okay, so part 2 is challenging the conformist view of culture. According to Tomasello, at some point in human evolution, it became important for individuals in a group to all behave alike. There arose pressure to conform. The proximate motivation was to be accepted in the group. It may be that imitation and conformity were in many ways the central processes that led humans in new directions evolutionarily. Richardson and Boyd and others have gone along with this thesis about strong conformity. They think it's what's needed to explain that there are so many distinctive groups, the diffusion of knowledge, and what they call in-group homogeneity and out-group heterogeneity. But conformity is not nearly as pervasive as assumed. Anthropological studies show that people often fail to conform even in circumstances where it is clearly to their advantage to do so. Conformity-biased learning has been argued as not even a stable or adaptive strategy, as a general evolutionary strategy. What seems to be needed instead is critical social learning. And the evidence in favor of strong conformity is particularly weak when people are motivated to be accurate. When it most matters, conformity is least likely. In social psychology, and here we're getting finally closer to home base for me, Ash, in his famous studies on what are usually viewed as his conformity studies, if they're viewed in terms of joint action, turn out to be quite different from what the standard mythology is. What he actually confronted participants with was a moral dilemma, not just an epistemological one. What should I say when I believe others are wrong? For the ones of you that don't recall, the problem here is that you see a question about whether the line on the left is equal to the line on which line on the right, but the trouble is 4 or 5 other people give the same wrong answer prior to your turn. So how does one pragmatically engage others with whom one disagrees sharply? So one thinks the correct answer here is C, for example, and everybody else may say A. It turns out, despite what textbooks tell you, 2/3 of all the answers that were given were dissents. The median response across all participants was to dissent 9 times. This occurred 12 times out of 18 different trials. 9 times and to agree 3 times with the majority. The experiments are more a testament to truth-telling than to conformity. About 25% always dissented, about 45% dissented a majority of the time. That's 70% right there that are dissenting all or most of the time, and about 30% dissented a minority of the time. I have argued that there are salient values here that are really shaping the Ash situation. People are trying to speak truthfully. They're trying to express their own view accurately and honestly. They have a tendency, they want to trust other people. They want to take seriously the value of other people's claims. They're all in perfectly good positions to see what's going on, so why not pay attention to them and what they think or what they think they see. Social solidarity, I think, is another value that's crucial here, which is a commitment to integrate the views of self and others without deprecating either. This, again, is described in a paper we just published in 2006. So the dilemma really becomes here, how does one speak the truth in a complex, tense, and frustrating situation in a way that simultaneously honors one's peers, the experimenter, one's own perception, and the situation in which all are embedded? What we argued was that people realize values pragmatically. The average participants in Ash's studies may have been signaling awkwardly, that is, take the ones that, for example, gave 9 dissenting answers, but then 3 times agreed with the wrong answer, may have been signaling awkwardly, but as best they could, the tension and truth of the situation as a whole, with the hope that it would leave themselves and their peers open to further dialogue. If one did what I think Ash expected them to do and wanted them to do, thought was the right thing to do, is if they always disagreed with incorrect peers in any real situation where you always disagreed with your peers about something that you all have information about, it would signal distrust and a lack of social solidarity. It would likely be a conversation stopper. That is, you're never going to find out why we're disagreeing when it looks like we ought to be agreeing with each other. Keeping the dialogue open, even in awkward and threatening situations, is crucial to learning what is really true. Developmental research here supports the same thing. Do children conform as demanded by Tomasello's thesis here? Tomasello's done research on this. Corbeau and Harris have done research on this. Bottom line is children, little 3- and 4-year-old children are remarkably like adults. If anything, they're even more likely to dissent. They dissented 65 to 80% of the time, all of the time. And that's true with either an adult majority or peer majorities. If you look at imitation research, children imitate more faithfully and precisely than apes, but that's because they're interested in more than practical success, just solving the puzzle or getting the food or whatever it is. They are selective in who, what, and when they imitate. They follow the lead of others who are accurate and are caring and are in good positions to know what is going on. They're remarkably sophisticated, it turns out. Lots of studies have shown this in terms of how they assess the truth claims of others. They often choose not to imitate any of the models to which they are exposed. They do things in their own way, but taking into account what they have observed. So it turns out even imitation, I think, is dialogical. It's not blind copying. What about conventions? Even here, the story about divergence is, the story is about divergence as well as convergence. There's evidence of synchrony and alignment, but, for example, people diverge in their syntactic instructions. As Healy and his colleagues have shown, conventions are created that are idiosyncratic and are flexibly revised, becoming progressively more complementary over time. Greg Mills has shown partial alignment proves better for problem solving. Fusaroli and others have shown. Francis argues any language spoken by more than a handful of people exhibits this tendency to split into dialects, which may differ from one another along many dimensions: vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, usage, social function, artistic and literary expression, etc. What does all this mean? It suggests that becoming caring, cooperative, and conversing does not mean blindly conforming to others, nor does it mean being independent, not paying attention, not caring about what other people think or say or see. Social learning and social action, interaction, are joint action. What makes it joint is not its sameness, nor its difference. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing. It's about relating to others in a way that realizes values. An example of this, consider the speaking from ignorance effect. So this is an experiment we did a few years ago where we're trying to kind of invert the Ash experiment to some extent. We have people sitting in front of a screen on which things like up at the right are there. What is the bottom word in the lower right-hand corner? The answer here would be warm. And people are sitting at either A, B, C, or D. It turns out that the real subject, we have Confederates at A and B, and the real subject is either sitting at C or D. When they're sitting at D, they cannot see clearly enough to answer correctly. So they basically are in a position of ignorance. So the question is, what do they do when A and B give the correct answer, which they do? What do they say? So the results of this speaking from ignorance effect experiment was as follows. To start with, you'd assume that this is not really a dilemma. This is kind of a no-brainer. What else could you possibly do other than repeat what people who are better informed than you have said, people at A and B? But it turns out no matter what people decide to do, and they do different things, they virtually always experience this as a dilemma. So here are the results. We've done this a variety of different ways. About 30% of the time, participants knowingly disagreed with correct answers. It's perfectly appropriate for them to agree all the time. Many people do this, but 30% of the time, participants knowingly disagree with correct answers. However, when they're at position C, they virtually never disagree. If we prime them to be honest, to be particularly sensitive to being honest, it turns out they disagreed 49% of the time, even when that meant giving up a possible financial reward. Now, this last result suggests something along the lines of why we think this occurs. We think the dynamics are much the same as in the Ash experiment. True social solidarity and trust are the values at stake here that people are trying to realize. People truthfully cannot see, so they often decide to reveal their ignorance. People want to speak truthfully and cooperatively, that is, with perceptual and pragmatic warrant. That is, they want to make a unique contribution to the conversation, if you want to think of it that way, based on their unique place in the dialogical array. But it turns out you really can't do that in this case. So they've got to decide what to do. That's why there's a dilemma. They trust other people's answers, and that turns out as the evidence supports that, and they trust others will trust their being true to their position. So expressing their ignorance makes them vulnerable. However, it may improve their ability to learn in the long run. Thus, the speaking from ignorance effect suggests that truth is about more than correctness. People care about more than just the goal of being correct, giving the correct answer. Social solidarity is about more than just agreeing with others. And trust is about more than just following blindly what other people say, even when you think they're correct. People are not simply goal-oriented. I want to be liked, I want to be correct, I want to belong, which is exactly what most social psychologists claim motivates people's actions. To conclude, cooperation emerged, I think, in the context of major reorganizations of physical and social anatomy. Scaling this up to cultural proportions requires not conformity, but dialogical learning that seeks to be discerning, that is selective and truthful and faithful, or we might say trust and social solidarity. Truth, trust, and social solidarity are among the values that must be realized for social relationships, social learning, and conversation to exist and to flourish. Overall, then, perception, action, cognition, and emotion, understood as values realizing activities, mean that caring is a form of caring, and caring is working to realize the goods, the values that demand our attention and action. What makes our human way of life special is the extent to which we cooperate and collaborate in groups, traveling over large spaces and long times to care for each other as well as ourselves and for the ecosystems that sustain us. Within this larger story, we converse in ways that begin as we look into the face of our mothers and others who will nurture and teach us, and as they look at our expressions of vulnerability and longing. Caretakers will challenge and be challenged, a dialogue that will begin that will seek to learn about the world and how we can care for it, especially for those with whom we share the task of caretaking. Thanks for listening, and I hope you found this helpful and provocative. Best wishes. Take care.